In this second video on ACI interface configuration made easy, I'm going to drill it into the leaf interface profiles in a little bit more detail. As you remember from the first video, there are a number of policies that we need to line up or connect up to actually enable an interface on our ACI fabric. There's everything from the VLAN pools to the domain, to the AEPs, to the policy groups, to the leaf interface profiles, and finally to the switch profiles. So in this video, we're going to look at these leaf interface profiles, so the logical definition of how I want a switch port to be configured. So the first thing that I need to do is go ahead and clean up my ACI fabric from before. So it's the same simulator, and as I mentioned on the first video, you can use any version of code that you want from a simulator perspective. All of these settings have been the same in ACI ever since version 1 code. So I'm going to dive into the access policies. And I'll go to my switches, so the top level binding of profile to a physical switch, and I'll go ahead and remove the logical binding. So I'll remove that leaf interface profile from the switch profile. The reason that I'm cleaning this up is just to make it easy to, easy to wash and easy to consume. You can use both modes concurrently, but I like to keep it nice and clean and simple. So I'll just remove everything that we had in place before. If I didn't do this, what I'd have is a number of alarms and I'd have a number of missing objects in the configuration. So just as a best practice, it's always a good thing to do to clean up the configuration as you go along. Next thing I'll do is I'll go to the leaf interface profile. So this is the logical definition of how I want the interfaces on the switches to be configured. And again, I'll go ahead and I'll actually remove all of the configuration that we had from the first video. So once this configuration has been removed, I've got, a completely empty config. So there's no profile defined, there's no binding to the switch at all. And now what I'll do is I'll start making definitions of how I want the ports to be configured. So in this case, instead of aligning it to the switches, I'm going to align it to the attached device. So in the first one I'll do is I'm going to configure ESX hosts on ports 1 through to 4. So I give it a name, and then I'm just going to add the interface selectors. So what type of port is it? Well, it's an Ethernet port, and it's port number 1. So ETH1, I'm going to give it the interface ID, so 1/1, and I'm going to reuse the policy group for my ESX host that I configured previously. Then I'm going to go and configure, again, Ethernet 2. So I'll call it ETH2, ETH3, and ETH4. So once I've got my 4 ports configured, or the definition of how I want my switch to be configured, what I can now do is, exactly as we did previously, we can go and bind that to the actual switches themselves. So I'll navigate back up to the switch at the top, and I'll select which switches do I want to configure. So in this first case, what I'm going to do is configure switches 101 and 102. I'm going to add my leaf interface profile to it, and that's all I have to do. So ports 1 through to 4 are configured straight away for ESX attachment. I can do the same thing on switches 3 and 4 as well, and those ports are configured. So as you can see, the benefit now is that I've got a cookie cutter, and every time I apply that to my switches or pair of switches or individual switches, those ports will be configured with that profile that I've defined. And in this case, it was for ESX on ports 1 to 4. The next thing that I'm going to do is configure additional interfaces. So let's look at what we'll configure next. I'm going to go in and create a profile for my ASR attachment. And if you remember, my ASR was configured on port 10. So I'll create a leaf profile for it. Again, Ethernet 10, and I'm going to pick the policy group that I'd configured previously. I then configure the VPC port, so in this case it's port 15, Ethernet 15, and this is going to be used for my Nexus 7K VPC. And then what I'll do is I'll just go and bind those in exactly the same way. So I'll go and place that logical definition that I want, port 10 to be configured, and I'll just drop that on switch 1. And here's the benefit of this type of approach is that once I've defined it once, I can just go and apply that to whichever switch I want, because I've abstracted away the logical definition of the switch and just said, I'm going to attach this device on port 10 and go and apply it. And what I'll do as well is I'll go to switches 3 and 4 and add my Nexus 7K VPC profile to that, and those 2 ports will also be configured. So at this point, I've got all of my switch ports configured, but there is another alternate way that I can configure things. So what I'll do now is I'll create another Leaf interface profile. Again, it's going to be for my ESX host. So in this case, I'll just create the profile. I'm going to say this is ESX host, and it's on ports 11 to 14. So the difference now, though, is that I'm going to give it a range. So the name is ETH 11 to 14, and I've given it a range of interface IDs. Again, I'm just using the same policy group that we've used previously, and I'll go ahead and actually apply this to the switches. So switches 3 and 4 are going to be configured ports 11 to 14 for ESX. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between the first way where I've configured individual ports and the second way where I configured a range of ports? Well, if I configure individual ports, what I can now do is go and add a description to the interface so that when I log onto a switch on the CLI, I could do, show interface ETH1/1, and it would have a description for ESX host number 1. So using individual ports, as I'm showing here, allows you to put an interface description per interface. However, if I give it a range of ports, I'm unable to do that because obviously it's a range and the same description goes onto every port within that range. So in this case, when I add my interface description, I just need to be a bit more abstract. So I can't name the individual host. So I'm just going to say the description is for an ESX host that's attached to that port. So as you can see, this is an alternate way of configuring the Leaf profiles, and you can absolutely use both naming structures simultaneously. So I could use the method that we used in the first example where each port on each switch was defined and configured individually. It's certainly the most flexible way of configuring the network because any port on any switch can actually be used for any purpose. However, this alternate way of doing it can be much quicker if your data center is very rigid from a design perspective. In both examples, though, what I would say is that you really do need to implement a very clear and simple naming structure to help you troubleshoot. As you saw, when I configured when I defined the names for the objects that I was attaching to the network, I would give it a very clear name. This is an ASR, it's number 1, it's on port 10. So whichever switch I apply that to, I know, very simply from looking at it, what will be configured on a given interface. So I would strongly encourage you to really define a simple and clear naming structure to make troubleshooting and configuring much simpler. Well, that's it for this second video. In the third video, what I'm going to do is actually look at the policy groups in a little bit more detail, just to actually see the different ways that I can configure the policy groups, and I'll just give a couple of examples. For part 2, that's it. Thank you very much for watching.